We'll just give people a minute and then we'll begin.
Let's begin.
Yeah, we'll begin. Okay. Good evening. My name is Mehta Krishnamurthy, and on behalf of the State Capacity Initiative at the Center for Policy Research, it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you this evening. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday evening to join us for this conversation. For us, it's a great privilege to have such a wonderful panel engage with a new report that we have just put out on the pandemic and public administration, which is based on a survey of IAS officers during the pandemic. We're really looking forward to the conversation, the discussion, and hopefully using some of the findings of the survey more as a setting and a context and a provocation for a deeper conversation around some very critical issues. The State Capacity Initiative at CPR is an interdisciplinary research and practice program which is focused on addressing the challenges of the 21st century Indian state. And the purpose of this initiative is to place the critical challenges of building state capacity at the heart of the field of policy research, where, in some ways it has always belonged, but remains surprisingly marginalized. And so we begin with first principles and ground ourselves in existing realities to think about how we might deepen and expand the understanding of the challenges and possibilities of building state capacity in a democratic and federal India. And in the process, our programs of work focus on the changing roles of the Indian state, institutional design, implementation, and administrative capacity, the challenges of regulatory and fiscal capacity, and the complex and changing relations between society, politics, and state capacity in India. In some ways, the focus of our work as it takes off is on people, the people of the state, on public administrators, on processes, and on public institutions. And when we think about people, I think it's incredibly important for all of us to consider the very vast and varied group of people who are public servants and public workers in India. Often, the focus is on the higher civil services and higher, leadership and administration. But our work, we really hope over the years to focus a lot, not only on the higher civil services, but also thinking deeply about field administration, regulators, frontline functionaries, and the whole range of people, both contractual and permanent, who compose the public administration and are public servants and public workers in contemporary India. Having said that, I think, although the IAS as a cadre gets more attention, and we definitely have vibrant public debates as we are having at the moment about the IAS, it is remarkable that there is actually very little systematic study and work. There is actually a rich literature on the evolution of the bureaucracy from colonial times, but when it comes to the contemporary bureaucracy, we don't have a tradition of building up this kind of research and studies. Many countries actually do regular surveys of the civil services. We had one in 2010, which was one of the first that was actually commissioned to look at the civil services survey, but they have tended to focus very much on resource intensive questions, less on organizational norms, values, organizational culture, and to think about the different kinds of constraints that shape the services. And so I think for us, this was an important opportunity to, really think about how we might approach these questions. And that was sort of one of the animating things behind this particular survey. I'll briefly share, and take you through a few slides just to set the context for, the survey that we're going to talk about today. And so, like we said, so in India, we don't have this context of surveys. And we also are very aware that surveys are only one kind of instrument or one sort of source of information. They have their limitations, but they also are an opportunity for us to engage with a wide number of administrators and to understand a set of common questions. At the same time, we had thought about this prior to COVID as the initiative was taking off. But the pandemic provided a sort of, very challenging, but also important collective context in which we thought we could explore some of these questions, not only because the spotlight in COVID and during the crisis was on the state, and questions of state capacity have been highlighted across the world. Public administrators, of course, were, including members of the Indian Administrative Service, have been at the forefront of implementing measures to manage the pandemic. But also because measures such as physical distancing, lockdowns, prolonged physical closure, travel restrictions required constant engagement with citizens and the public, and also with a range of different kinds of public and private institutions over what is an undefined period of time. And so it really gave us an opportunity to explore questions in the context of the pandemic that we hope can begin a conversation and a process of reflection that might extend beyond to think about some of the larger questions that all of us want to also engage with. And so this report that we've put out presents and discusses some of the key findings of this survey. And the purpose really was to gather insights into underlying values, norms, attitudes, and practices of the Indian bureaucracy today, and the extent to which these may be widely shared or divergent or contested among the IAS. It was not an assessment or evaluation of the state's response, which is something that requires very different kinds of work and a lot more context and embeddedness, and will happen, I'm sure, over time, and has already started happening. But I think this was not the purpose of this survey. We fielded the survey in August and September, so it was about 7 to 8 months into the pandemic, and therefore some of the questions and of course responses also reflect the experiences up until that time that civil servants had had. At this moment, with the vaccine, with vaccine rollout, vaccine hesitancy, new questions also emerge, and it would be interesting to think about some of the insights from the survey for this moment as well. We explored 3 critical relationships: the relationships between different levels of the state and between, political, executive, the bureaucracy, and within the bureaucracy itself, the interaction between the state bureaucracy and the public, and bureaucratic perceptions of the role of civil society, the private sector, international organizations, and the media, and their consequences for public administration. Like I said, we haven't had such surveys, and so we weren't sure. This was also an exercise to see whether we might be able to get a response. We tried to keep the survey very short and, reach out as much as we could, but we were very, very lucky and to get such a great response. So we did get a response from 526 serving officers and 44 former officers, and the initial target sample was about 400, so we exceeded that. Each response was weighted. So we have now what is a cadre representative sample looking across. So we have from all cadres representatives here. So what we've presented in the report are 3 kinds of results: the full sample of the 526 serving officers, and then disaggregated results on each of the questions based on seniority of 2 kinds. So officers who joined before and after 2011, and then we have the former officers as well. And 2011 we took as a view of thinking about people who would be in the field and closer to having their field postings, and then those who would be serving, in policy positions as well. And then disaggregation by states and union territories, which we did through the Niti Aayog has a Sustainable Development Goals Index, which divides states into aspirant, performer, and front-runner states. I think there's one other, but these were in 2018, these were the states were categorized within these 3. So we also have some cadre representative things. So, I'll just very quickly in the next few minutes take you through a few slides. So the first one was really focused on the Indian state bureaucracy and crisis response. And we were focused on individual and institutional commitments to public service, resource mobilization and innovation, autonomy and delivery in a time of crisis, and perceptions on the role and effects of politicians. And not surprisingly, this was one where we got a lot of convergence. Generally, a high level of confidence in the state's ability to respond to crisis. There was a high commitment to public service above personal risk, even though, this was a time when there was quite a lot of reporting and, clearly risk, because IAS officers and all frontline workers were out in the field very early on and have remained so throughout. There are high levels of motivation which were reported, and all of this was supported by, a strong ability to deploy resources towards a single cause, autonomy of states, it's clear saying that this is important, and a preference for innovation. So just to give you a sense, there was a sense that health systems preparedness did happen and increased reasonably well. So there was a sense that the state can galvanize, especially when it comes to infrastructure. There was a strong commitment expressed by IAS officers towards states having autonomy to formulate a response during the crisis in requirement, keeping in mind their own needs and capacities. But also, and this would be interesting for people to reflect on, that, the sense was that during a crisis, particularly, the focus on the objective being pursued and innovatively interpreting orders would actually get a lot more appreciation from superiors. It was also interesting, we asked a number of questions around new pressures having to do with communication, because this is a pandemic in which public administration has really been challenged in terms of its capacities to communicate with the public. And there was very much a clear sense that this is important, that interestingly there was a strong feeling that the front line was very effective, much more effective than the political executive. When you compare frontline workers and political speeches, for example, in terms of being able to send messages out. And there was also a focus on long-term communication in a crisis like the pandemic. So here, again, interesting to see for most IAS officers, the sense is that they should be circumspect or ordinarily would not put themselves in the front line of communication, but that in this kind of emergency, that they must play an active role in communicating. About 20.5% of IAS officers felt that they should play such an active role at all times. But in most cases, you can see people going against their grain or their understanding of the role of IAS officers here. Also about 85%, similar to the strength, of the result on autonomy, about 85% really felt that long-term, for a crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic, that it's really important to mount an effective and consistent communication campaign. So, rather than think about strict enforcement of penal measures. And this worked alongside people feeling that we have enough rules and laws. In fact, we have too many rules and laws, and it's not about over-regulating. But at the same time, we saw certain tensions and trade-offs that also emerged. So when you start looking at bureaucratic perceptions of public cooperation, here is where we started observing some interesting tensions. For example, when it comes to the success of the lockdown, to the extent that you could say the lockdown met its goals, about 55% felt that it was about the public that had understood the restrictions, and it was about willing cooperation, whereas 45%, which is a very high number, felt that the public had observed restrictions due to fear of law. So although we have too many rules and laws, and although there was a very strong focus on public sort of cooperation, this is a striking finding. We did find some variation. So former civil servants and frontrunner states were more likely to focus on, the public and public cooperation than other states and younger officers. So that was quite striking as well. And when it came to virulence, again, just to give you a sense that, there was a high sense that this was really about underreporting was due to both, underreporting by the public because of stigma and state capacity issues in terms of the state's ability to test. But when you come to the failure of people to self-report, the biggest driver was seen as fear of ostracization by the community. And here again, you see that officers from the least resource states and were the most likely right, to blame the public and say that it was really about this. And you see former civil servants and others putting a little more emphasis on shifting the balance to the state's capacity to deliver. So again, these are interesting and important tensions that we noted. And finally, when it comes to partnerships and interests in the pandemic, we looked at media, civil society, the private sector, and international organizations. And we found quite a lot of divergence here too. Some interesting, there was a generally very positive response to the role of the media, although there was an understanding about the problems and the irresponsible behavior of the media as well. There were very mixed views on international organizations. There was 60% were overall positive, but you did see a lot of critique as well on this. Aspirant state cadres were more strongly in favor of the guidance provided by international organizations like the WHO. There was again 60% were positive about the view of NGOs. The front-runner states, interestingly, where you might have higher state capacity, were more neutral about the role of NGOs. And there was a striking disregard and suspicion of the private sector. So about only 11% felt the private sector had gone out of its way in providing essential services during the pandemic. 53% held a largely negative view. So this just gives you a sense of the breakup on NGOs. And similarly, this is on the role of the private sector. And so you see here, we had asked a question which was really focused on regulatory capacity. And here, again, it's an interesting response. So front-runner states are less, gung-ho or positive about NGOs, thinking of them as not necessarily critical partners. But when it comes to the private sector, they're also less negative. And in both cases, front-runner states were more likely to, IAS officers in front-runner states were more likely to emphasize the importance of their impact on regulation, the role of the state as a regulator. This is some sense. We will share the report with you on the link in the chat box. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to see it, please take a look. We've already put the link there, and you could take a look at the report. But this is just to give you some sense of some of the questions that we picked up. There are a lot more in there, and we've tried to put in some analysis as well. So I will now hand over to co-author on this and co-plotter, Deepak Sanan, who will share a few of his thoughts, and then we'll turn over to the panelists.
Thank you, Meghla. I'm going to be very brief because I'm sure everybody's waiting to hear the panel. I have just to add to all that Meghla said. I would just like to add that what was it that really motivates us at the State Capacity Initiative to look at behavior? And it is this clear linkage with outcomes which many people are talking about, that behavior is becoming a key factor to look at rather than resources of various kinds in understanding responses. And if we have to understand behavior, needless to say, we have to look at views, perceptions, norms, incentives which dictate that behavior. And that is what was really behind structuring this in this fashion, this survey. And for me, as a former civil servant, having been through decades in the service and never been surveyed, never been asked, what did I really feel about things in this fashion? Was suddenly it seemed something which was so interesting and which should have been done. It might have helped in a lot of ways many of us think through some of our issues. And it was indeed extremely gratifying when we actually conducted the survey to see the kind of reactions from so many IAS officers that this is so interesting, this is something which we really like, we are being made to think about some of the issues, to think about what makes us behave in particular ways and what we feel about certain things. And that, I think, was the most gratifying part of doing this survey, and something which makes me feel that it isn't something to engage with for years to come, that we must probe, we must examine, and we must ask, and we must then give back what we find, so that maybe that whole idea of nudging behavior has some meaning. Thank you. And I'll hand over to Yamini to take over at this stage.
Thank you. On behalf of the Center for Policy Research, I wanted to first thank Deepak and Mehta and the entire team at the State Capacity Initiative for putting together this marvelous survey. I remember when we first started plotting the idea of understanding the bureaucracy in not just in terms of bare bone numbers, how many, who they are, where they come from, but much more from the point of view of what the bureaucracy actually is as an organization, its sociology, its norms, its culture, and the ways in which it operates. We did have many conversations about viability, possibility, feasibility, mixed methods, surveys versus ethnographies. And it's really gratifying to see that over all those conversations, we were actually able to put together something that actually provides us with a very important starting point for what I hope is going to be a longer term engagement with many of these questions. Before I hand over to the panel, I did want to very quickly also thank our panelists for taking time to be with us. It's a real honor for CPR to have such a distinguished group of civil servants and former civil servants join us today. We have learned tremendously from all of you and continue to learn and work with you in different capacities. So it's really a privilege and pleasure for us to have you here. For the sake of the audience, I will quickly do a round of introductions, although all of you are so well known. We have here to begin with, in order of batch, batches and rank, and so I always get confused with the hierarchy of the bureaucracy, but let me try and do this in order of seniority. We have Aditi Mehta, 1979 batch IAS officer from Rajasthan, who retired as ACS Government of Rajasthan. Then we have Mr. Anil Swarup, 1981 batch of the IAS from the UP cadre, who retired as Secretary School Education, but he was also Secretary of the Ministry of Coal and Additional Secretary of Labor and Empowerment, and led the RSBY that eventually became the roadmap for Ayushman Bharat. Then we are privileged to be joined by Mr. Sanjeev Chopra, who is a West Bengal batch IAS officer and is currently director at the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration. And Vini Mahajan, 1987 batch IAS from the Punjab cadre, who's currently Chief Secretary of the Government of Punjab. A very, very warm welcome to all of you. Let me start by just asking each one of you for just a few minutes to give us some of your initial thoughts and reactions to the report itself. And then what I hope to do through the course of the next half hour or so was to dive into some of the more specific tensions that Mehta laid out as she gave us the sort of broad overview of the findings from the survey. So Aditi, can I start with you?
Yeah. Thank you, Yamini. Thank you, Mehta. And it's a great pleasure to encounter so many old friends, and especially Vini after so many years. So thank you very much for including me in this really stellar panel. So I would just like to say that just as a small aside, that most of us as practitioners have not had the time to pause and reflect on our jobs during service. And I also agree with Deepak that perhaps if we had had this kind of an interaction, this kind of introspection, maybe we would have had different views in the course of some of our own postings. About the report itself, I feel this is an extremely valuable report and extremely revealing, even though some of the nuances were a bit disquieting for me, and I will subsequently cite these. I also appreciate the idea of a state capacity project, because as the state expands into additional areas, sectors of social infrastructure and so on, as well as the more intrusive areas of personal life, in the recent times. There's also a simultaneous hollowing out of state institutions, major state institutions, especially of the welfare architecture. So I think it's important to understand this, not just in terms of the politics and economics, but also the sociology and the ethnographic dimension of this. So in the next few minutes, I just want to lay out a few things that struck me as I was going through this. So one thing I think we would all agree that the state response to COVID has been deeply paradoxical. The state was the cause of deep distress, causing a huge humanitarian crisis, leading to suffering, hardship, violence, consequent of a 4-hour notice for an indefinite, nationwide lockdown, and almost undertaken as an undercover operation, as happened during the demonetization. And at the same time, simultaneously, the state was seen as a provider, providing succor, providing relief in terms of hospitals, quarantine centers, essential supplies, and subsequently Narega, and so on for unemployed laborers. And of course, now the supplier of vaccines to the polity. So one or two things the report highlighted, that number one, that the bureaucracy perceived that it rose to the occasion as a team, showing capabilities to mobilize, those 4 words you use: motivate, innovate, and communicate. But the report also stated that concerted action is missing during routine functioning. And to me, 2 inferences arise. Number one, perhaps even during routine times, there is space to work more innovatively at the intersections of sectors. Health, education, and so on have already been mandated for close interaction. But more than that, I would like to just say, in routine times, all government staff cannot work in tandem, and it may not even be feasible or possible or even desirable. And during the pandemic, the teacher, the A&M, the fair price shop dealer, the police, everyone was centered on the aims of effective COVID management. At least in Rajasthan, I can say that pretty consistently. And this was also possible as all routine functioning was stopped or stayed. There were no schools, there was nothing else going on. And so there was a fully paid government manpower, team of government manpower, which was available for this kind of COVID deployment. And I think that's why there was this kind of effective management. And the other point is that the report clearly states that the officers were deemed to be highly motivated, with public service commitment, and enjoying high levels of public trust. Now, this is really balm to all of our ears, because we are constantly assailed with complaints of a trust deficit. So for officers themselves to feel that they were appreciated and they were valued is very important and wonderful. And I think we welcome it. But I think the report could also investigate cases as to why and how aberrations to the above occur. And I think such examples were also legion. I know myself that many examples of rent-seeking behavior were sort of exposed, also at the level of districts, but certainly at the level of lower staff, food arrangements in the same district. You have a plate of lunch for 50 rupees, you have it for 380 rupees for lorries, contracts for requisitioning of buildings for quarantine centers, for temporary hospitals, delivery of essential commodities to colonies on lockdown, and so forth. So I think it would be interesting to investigate whether this differs from state to state, or is there a difference in administrative culture or social ethos, or any other sociological factor. So then also this, the page 6 of the report quoted that 83%, which is a huge number, 83% of the IAS officers that were surveyed felt that the states should have the autonomy to formulate their own responses based on local needs and capacities. Yet simultaneously, 53 and 51% of the officers, especially in the aspiring and performer states, expressed a preference for the strong hand, for direction, and to be told that, well, this is how we're going to do it. And and also that compliance is due to the public fearing the law. So what does this actually mean? I mean, the lesson I took or the takeaway for me was that while officers seek autonomy for themselves, for the states, it is a little difficult to give that same kind of devolution of authority, of responsibility to the field. And so there is a genuine lack of confidence in public understanding, public cooperation, public compliance. And so maybe that leads to the centralization of powers in certain states against a more consensus-based approach of administration in some other states. And so thus, more than the political executive, then possibly are IAS officers themselves responsible for the attributes or the epitaph of the nanny state, because these are all officers that express this position. Then the pandemic and the migrant crisis showed the visible extent of poverty and malnutrition among the working class in our society. And in the report, 70% of the officers felt that the lockdown increased health system preparedness. Now, as substantive preparedness cannot be attained in a few short months, I felt that perhaps a related question could include what actual improvement the health system or the health infrastructure could evince, given the consistent underfunding and the underfunded nature of the health sector in our country. And perhaps this study can force us to examine why the slow burn issues, IMR, MMR, child under fire mortality, child malnutrition, etc., continue to persist despite so many multi-pronged attempts. And I think we should also perhaps, acknowledge that COVID response, and not just anecdotally, also crowded out the health sector response to other morbidities. And I know that there was a demonstration in rural Rajasthan by some of the doctors in PHCs that TB and other patients are consistently now being edged out because of the emergent urgency due to COVID. And I think this point was made by Deepak, migrant crisis also forced the administration to rely more on NGOs, civil society, social movements, and this kind of close alliance where both state and non-state actors are still working. And I think these are some of the things I took out. I look forward, of course, to a larger conversation and to hearing all the friends here and learning.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. Thank you, Aditi. I'm going to break IAS precedent of seniority and try and map voices of those who were in the thick of it with those who, as part of the IAS community, were also observing it, observing what was happening through those difficult months of the lockdown and the immediacy as we unlocked, just to be able to give the audience both perspectives simultaneously. So Vini, I'm going to come to you next to hear your perspective. One of the things that Aditi mentioned in her remarks, which has always struck me as well in conversations both with the IAS as well as about the IAS, or rather about public administration in India more generally, how we are really good at managing crises because we can break all the silos, come together and get going, and how we completely fail when those very elements of crisis need to get routinized into the everyday of the bureaucracy. It's, to me, that's one of the fundamental questions that drives a lot of my thinking about the challenges of public administration in India. So just as you reflect on the report, also to hear your thoughts on that too.
Thank you, Yamini. It's a challenge coming in after Aditi ma'am and her the sweep of her comments. But before I talk about the report, I really want to step back and compliment you at CSR, all of you actually, CPR, I beg your pardon, for focusing on the building state capacity issue. Yamini, we've discussed this earlier. I think this is really important. It's getting ignored. And it's not just Sanjeev Chopra and the Mussoorie Academy that need stronger work on what can be done for building state capacity. I believe that I'm basically an optimist. I must state that up front. I believe the civil service in general, the senior civil service in particular, is a bunch of good, committed people on the whole. They're mostly smart. They certainly have the capacity to work hard, at least where it's important to them. They couldn't make it without that capacity. And I think these capacities do show up in situations where there is a general belief that the issue is important and needs to be tackled with some urgency. And so the point that you made, yes, we've always been good at tackling emergencies, especially in those states where we've had a system of strong governance, but generally all over the country. Because there is a committed, and I mean committed in the purest sense of the term, there is generally a committed bureaucracy that is looking to mitigate suffering. Having said that, and this is the kind of thing which showed up in COVID times as well. You know, any number of our DCs ended up COVID positive. There were others in the in the secretariat and so on, and yet it always came as a bit of a surprise to us when you heard that all the multilaterals, all the consultants, all the private corporate sector was steadfastly working from home, whereas for us it was just after the hard lockdown. In fact, many of us were obviously going to work even during the hard lockdown, but immediately after that, it was back to in some sense business as usual, going back to workplaces. Of course, we did implement 50% strength, but that was only because of the concern that if everybody gets affected, then everything will shut down. So government offices continued to remain open through pretty much all of 2020, barring a very limited period and so on. The more difficult question of why do we not do as well for handling important but endemic kind of issues like malnutrition or so many gender-related issues. Why can't we drive MMR down in the same way as we try to beat down the COVID positivity rate? I think, I mean, we all basically understand that there are very serious and complex problems in the country. It's not really feasible to expect that the most committed of the district head or even a team at the district level will be able to sort out all those problems. And I think we are, all of us, trying to work on the endemic issues as well. And I think, I strongly believe that day by day in every way, we are getting better and better. It's not as though things are either at a standstill or generally declining in terms of social indicators or efforts by the government to tackle those across the country. But those are hard nuts to crack. It is difficult to deal with all the issues. So it's so much easier to say that we will deal with COVID and then everybody is dealing with COVID. But if you try and step back and, as a Chief Secretary of Punjab, if I try to look at my priorities, I mean, almost everything that I can look at is a priority. Violence against women is a priority. Gangsterism in jails is a priority. Our atrocious MMR is, of course, a priority. So there are so many things, and then you try and get acting on each one of those things. And when you are dealing with that subject is of overriding importance. It's critical. You want to give it all your time and energy, but then there is another issue, and then there is another issue. And so, and all said and done, we are also relatively underserved in terms of the administrative manpower. I mean, for the kind of population that we have, all our ratios on a per capita basis, I mean, the judiciary has this awful overhang of cases, but then they will argue that the number of cases they are doing is like multiple times what the developed countries do. And the same thing for a doctor, and the same thing for an IAS officer. I mean, the amount of work that you're expected to do, all said and done, we do need multiple times the bureaucracy that we have. Unfortunately, we have over the years built up this bloated civil service who are only providing staff support to the bureaucracy itself and not direct function of the government. And this is something, for example, in Punjab that we are trying to sort out by restructuring every department to say that you don't need so many peons, but if you're an animal husbandry department, you don't have enough veterinary officers. So go ahead and recruit more veterinary officers and do away with the peons. So there are issues of how the bureaucracy is structured. There are issues around how much bandwidth is available. There's certainly complexity of issues. There's paucity of resources. I mean, there's all of that. But I think we're doing well. So for the moment, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thanks, Vini. Anil, I'll turn to you for your broad remarks on the survey itself and your observations, but also wanted you to reflect a little bit for us on the issue of one of the important tensions that Mehta highlighted in her early remarks, which is really on the role of the role and relationship vis-a-vis the public, and the division, I think, in responses we got on the challenge of engaging the public response to the state, which some saw was a response as a consequence of coercion, and others saw was a sort of a response as citizens performing their duty. And how does the state, which always has a monopoly over violence, yet has to be a deliberative and participatory state? And you've sort of, from coal to between labor, coal, and education, engaged with all three of these different elements of what the state does, build these dynamics of its engagement with citizens, perceived citizens from the inside. To you. Sorry, you're on mute.
First of all, thank you for inviting me here. I was wondering, what am I doing here actually? I'm not really good at what you all are doing in writing reports and talking on those reports. And I was wondering whether I should join in here, but I found that Sanjeev Chopra was also in the list. So after having not interacted with him for reasons best known to him for the past year and a half, I thought I'll have a chat with him. This will be a nice way to meet him. And then of course, meeting Deepak is always a pleasure. Now, this is a wonderful, wonderful report. I think I went through the report, very well documented, very well researched. But I was wondering, what is it used for me? How is it useful to me? Or for that matter, how is it useful to any civil servant? It can probably help an academic to better understand a civil servant. And someone rightly used the phrase, understanding the reality. Of course, that can also be a bit of a question mark here. Reality, we have constricted it to the pandemic time, and we are understanding that reality in the context of a bureaucrat. Of course, the whole context has undergone a change in the past week after that statement in the parliament. So the context has undergone a change. So what are we talking about? We are talking about the response of civil servants themselves on something which they did themselves. I'm not very sure whether this report will help me change the reality. So as a die-hard practitioner through 38 years of my service, handling some of sensitive assignments, I feel something which is not useful to me, and I'm a pakka banya in that. For pure academic interest, I would read something else. This is pure academic exercise. And I would like to be challenged on that 5 years down the line. What benefit has this report done to the civil service That needs to be assessed. Actually, we do a lot of assessment of activity on the ground. We don't assess reports. In fact, in a number of interactions with the World Bank that I had while doing RSPY, I used to ask them, did you go back to a project that you left 5 years ago to assess? Is it continuing? Is there? So as an academic, it is very good. You'll come up with wonderful, wonderful reports and have wonderful, wonderful discussions. But until unless, as I said, I'm a practitioner, until unless it helps me improve myself, I'm not very sure whether this exercise is worth it. So yes, it perhaps, and I'd say perhaps, because my reading of the IAS in 38 years that I was, and I may be totally wrong, and I have written about it as well, there is virtually no ethos of the IAS. What is the distinctive feature of the IAS that if when he walks into a room, or when he speaks, you can say, yes, he's an IAS officer. There's actually no distinctive ethos. The problem here is that whether it is selection, and with due apologies to Sanjeev, or training at the academy, we are coming up with fantastic, brilliant individuals. We are not creating an ethos of the IAS, where that IAS officer can proudly say, no, of course he can't say proudly because he's now an IAS Babu. He can proudly say that I am an IAS officer, and these are the attributes that I have that are distinct from anybody else here. So what we are trying to do here is, we have individuals, bright, brilliant, doing brilliantly. Some of them are really outstanding. Some of them are accidental leaders, but they are individuals, authors, singers, musicians, doing very well in their jobs, but not as a group. And that's the real problem. What I saw, and I don't think many of people sitting here, anyone worked as Secretary Government of India, and I saw that everyone has his own empire. And you talked about state functioning and delegation of power to the states. The shocking bit is, those very officers who sit in the states want more power to the states. In Secretary's Committee in Government of India, the comments are absolutely amazing. They look at states with disdain. They do not want to delegate it. I'm talking of almost every Secretary Government of India. So this survey actually tells you what IAS officers think of themselves. Okay. And there also, I'm not very sure whether they're speaking the truth, most of them. I don't know, because my perception, I'm today in touch with hundreds of serving IAS officers, not one or two, hundreds. My perception is very different from what comes out in some of the surveys. There is absolutely no doubt that a large number of them would perform given the right environment. They would perform. And I totally agree with one perception, at least, that given in a pandemic, I think they perform the best. The real assessment should be that if an officer who performs so brilliantly, and by and large brilliantly, in a pandemic, why doesn't he do that similarly when there's no pandemic? It's like a country of ours where a culture is, if there is a war, everyone comes together. Except for a war, I think we are pulling each other's legs and doing nothing. Same goes for the civil service here. I think in a pandemic, I think IAS officers, it's not only here in COVID pandemic. Look at what happened in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, in Surat. Anywhere there is a pandemic, they're the best around. They get everyone around, do it. What needs to be assessed, if it really has to be assessed, is an IAS officer who performs so brilliantly in a pandemic. I can intuitively say something, but that should not be the case. I think research should center around, okay, this happened in COVID. Many officers did well. Of course, there were shortcomings here and there. People talk about migrant workers and all. I don't think it was a creation of a civil servant migrant work problem. It was purely a political problem created by politicians, and officers were asked to handle it. In fact, actually, despite all the bad name that the bureaucracy has, much of the problem gets created by a political decision. And then you are asked to manage it. So what happens in JNU or Jamia Millia? It's basically a political problem, and a civil service is asked to manage it. Some of them do it well, some of them don't do it well. So let's cut out that part and see the same civil servant who does so well in pandemic, what happens to him when there's no pandemic. And then you can try and change the reality, because ultimate objective of any exercise should be attempt to change the reality. Of course, you can't change the reality unless you understand it. So as a first step, it's very fine that you've tried to understand the reality. But the next step should be, how do you change? I mean, right through my career of 38 years and even after that, my attempt is how to understand and attempt to change that reality. It's very simple, because it's to an outsider who's not a part of civil service, Everyone has ideas, you can write brilliant papers. The best of reports are never implemented. The best of reports. Why? Because it's very easy to have an idea. But for an idea to fructify, and I'll conclude with this, idea to fructify in a democracy like ours, it has to be politically acceptable, socially desirable, technologically feasible, financially viable, administratively doable, judicially tenable, and I've added a seventh dimension thanks to this farm legislation. It has to be emotionally relatable. Now, I don't have time to explain all that, but if you are really bothered about changing the reality, because I'm concerned about changing the reality. If only understanding reality, then you should have only academics sitting here discussing how beautiful this report is, what has happened, what do the bureaucrats do, why don't they do it? You can do all that. But 5 years down the line, Sanan, revisit this report. Did it impact anywhere? If it has not impacted anywhere, it's a pure, simple academic exercise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anil. You've raised the challenge, and it's a very, very important one about what one does. There is a process of understanding. There is also a very crucial process of conversion of understanding into actually being able to drive and move change in the right direction. So I do hope that 5 years from now, you will come back to our platform to discuss all the things that we change as a consequence of building this understanding. But let me take that question to you, Sanjeev, as well, along, of course, with your broader reflections on the report and what we've learned, to this question of, I think, the challenge that Anil sort of posed to us in a sense, how does one build a space for reflection and engagement? Because the one thing that strikes me always every time I have walked into a public administrator's office, from the Gram Panchayat secretary all the way up to the Prime Minister's office, is how busy and constant it is in terms of managing the everyday of running this large and complex country, and how there isn't even a moment to sit back and reflect, which for us as researchers and academics is always quite remarkable, because we spend all of our time reflecting, perhaps too much time understanding and reflecting on converting understanding into action without actually doing the action. So when we think, I mean, one of the reasons why we were motivated to do this, as Deepak said, was that we saw that there's perhaps some value to reflection by practitioners. And what is interesting also about this is that we see quite interesting differences in perceptions of younger officers who are in the front lines, officers at senior positions who are making the policies. How does that reflection actually play into thinking about training, building capability of the administrator to manage the realities they confront? Sorry, you're mute.
Okay. Thank you, Yamini, and thank you to the panel. And it's always a challenge. The challenge has increased because of Mr. Swarup's very pithy comment. Much of it is very valid. But let's first of all address this question of what defines an IAS officer, and why is it that all IAS officers have different perceptions? That's because we are supposed to be different. We are not members of a uniformed service, and therefore I welcome the fact that all IAS officers have different perceptions, and their perceptions of the people in the field who are actually doing the work is very different from perceptions of people in the 10 to 15 years of service where they're giving advice. And it's very different from the viewpoint of the secretaries who are in the thick of things and are attending international conferences and giving a broad spectrum theory, and has to be very different from people who are superannuated and can now look back and say that things could have been better. Now, saying that things could have been better, hindsight being the best insight, that's agreed. The fact that we have so many different perceptions is very significant. Also, the fact that the aspirational districts, or rather aspirational states, why is it that UP and Bihar and Assam have this view about the private sector? Because there is no interaction with the private sector at the district level. How much of the private sector does the DM of Ara come in contact with, or how much of the private sector does the DM of Samastipur get in touch with? But certainly the DM in Gurgaon or the DM in an industrially advanced place, he has greater interaction. Therefore, all our perceptions are based on our interaction. They're based on what we see. what we feel, what we do. And naturally, the districts which have done very well, say Puducherry or Punjab and Kerala, Tamil Nadu, where things have done well, there the perception is that yes, we can achieve. And where things have not gone very well, obviously the perception is that they need to improve. So I think these are all, so I think when it comes to the report actually for me, the empirical confirms the anecdotal. Whatever was known to me anecdotally that this is how we do, this is how we operate, actually has got an empirical basis on your report. And that's therefore the significance of this report is that now you have an empirical document to take your facts forward. Without an empirical document to take your facts forward is basically in the domain of the anecdotal. And so far, all of us in the IAS have been talking about the anecdotal. This is what we could do. I'm glad that Vini is an eternal optimist. She's optimist. Mrs. Mehta has brought out the difficulties, the challenges, but there was no empirical basis to this. Therefore, I'd like to compliment all of you for having brought out this report, which shows the difference of perceptions of various states and people at different levels of seniority. And I think it's very important. As long as the younger people, as long as the people who are today in the field, as long as the district magistrates and municipal commissioners feel that they are in a position to control, command, and direct authority, and direct various things, it's a given thing. It's a very positive thing. Now, the second issue that we got to concern ourselves with that why is it that we work better during emergencies? Because the goal and the task is very clear. And when the goal and the task is very clear, and let me take this forward. You see, not just in this, but whenever you have a mission mode in government, whether it is when Mr. Anil Swarup was heading APIDA and I worked with him, whether it is the National Horticulture Mission or the National Health Mission, whenever we have very clear targets and whenever there are very clear, when there is a clear line of funding available, we can do miracles. Miracle is basically hard work and putting together all, we can do it. Now, there is a larger ecosystem. There's a larger ecosystem in which an IAS officer operates. And that ecosystem varies from state to state. Let's be clear about it that the ecosystem of West Bengal is different from the ecosystem of Maharashtra, and the ecosystem of Punjab is different from the ecosystem of Gujarat. And at various points of time, these ecosystems change because of the personality of the person at the political helm and the rapport that exists between the political leadership and the bureaucracy. Remember, I will just give you one instance, something which I just read about a week ago, and I'm very fond of sharing that. You see, to run a government system or to run a large public system is to understand what is the Raj Dharma. And there is the political executive, which is the Raj Shakti, and anybody could be in that Raj Shakti through dynastic. In the times of monarch, it used to be the dynast. Now it is the political leadership, which is the Raj Shakti. He has the Prabhu Shakti or he has the sovereign power. But when it comes to Mantrana Shakti and Utsaha Shakti, that is the ability to advise and the ability to give the things with proper confidence and with full confidence, that is certainly within the domain of the civil service, and that is where we can improve ourselves. There are certain things that we cannot change, and there are certain things that we can change. Now, a very simple thing which came out here was that there was a lot of discretion involved in giving permits to people. And obviously, ex-IAS officers and political leaders and all of them had perhaps a better access to the officers, and they were able to. That is because we were not able to develop foolproof systems. Wherever we have foolproof systems, we do much better. And I think over the last, and not just now, but over the last 20, 30 years, I certainly find that in state capacity, the role of the architecture of the systems is improving. Now, whether it is the Aadhaar card, whether it is the Fasal Bima Yojana, I certainly find that things are getting better than they were 10 years ago because we are moving into a systems-driven administration. Now, in a crisis situation, it is much easier to enforce certain norms because the direction and the goal is very clear. This direction and goal is not so clear when it comes to general and the day-to-day functioning of things. And the point which was made earlier by Vini that we really are understaffed. We really are understaffed. People are under a lot of, they have to do a lot of work. This was not a question which you asked. But okay, some of the things which I just wanted to reflect on. One was the point about behavior. How do we change behavior? How do we change ourselves? At least now we know that what we think of ourselves. Earlier we didn't even know what we think of ourselves and how we respond. What is our thought about the process? So there's a lot of learning to be had from this report. There's a lot of learning that we also take from Mr. Anil Swarup when he says that, all right, all these things must lead to a particular direction. And yes, I think in the academy, I'd like to share some things which for all the important. One is that increasingly we realize that it is not an individual who operates. Back in our times, in the 80s, we were told that IAS officers are knights in the shining armor, and we can go around, and get things done. Now the entire emphasis is on teamwork. The entire emphasis is on teamwork. And the three things which we are really focusing on are negotiation, communication, and leadership. Because the domain scan, you see, earlier in our times, the whole focus, as Vini would recall, was that, you have to have knowledge, you have to have skills, and you also need to have an attitude. Now the whole thing is changing. Now it is attitude, skills, and knowledge, because attitude is the most important. The defining factor is a positive attitude. We're trying to work towards that, and things will not change overnight. It's a process. And this study is a part of that larger process of understanding who we are. Know then thyself. I mean, if we don't know what we think about ourselves, how will we change? And it's important that all of us have a general and a broad understanding of what we have to do. Expecting all IAS officers to be part of the same cut piece cloth is certainly not a desirable element, and I would not recommend it. I mean, the beauty of the IAS is the diversity of opinions that we have, and the fact that we are committed to constitutional value. That is the strength of the service. And with every passing decade, the way we look at the service changes, the way our expectations. In fact, the biggest challenge for us is the rising expectations, and those expectations are rising because we've delivered. If we had not delivered, the expectations would not have been raised about us. Now, the other thing about what and there's a reference always that what the political leadership thinks about, we have to see this statement of the Prime Minister also in the context of many statements that he has made, and many statements, especially when he talks at the Aram program, where all the younger IAS officers participate. I mean, he gives them such a positive energy, gives them such a positive feel that that's your responsibility. So whether it is the Atmanirbhar Bharat or whether it is the Naveen Bharat, with the local, who's going to do it? We're going to do it, and we will be doing it. There will be challenges, but we have the competence and the ability to overcome all these things. And I think this report is very valuable because it tells us about ourselves. So thank you very much, CPR, for giving us this document. And 5 years from now, we will revisit this conversation and we'll see how the civil services have taken challenges in their stride. I have absolutely no doubt about the competence of the civil services, and especially about the competence of the younger ones who are joining. Thank you.
No, in fact, not 5 years from now, we hope we can do more of these surveys across a range of issues. So we'll be bothering you much earlier. But yes, let's wait for 5 years for outcome. But let me come to two other issues that I was hoping we could tease out with the panel, and I'll touch a little bit on some of the questions that the audience has also posed, so that we are able to respond to what's on the minds of people who are listening in as well. Vini, one of the interesting things about the report was how clearly the center state, the sort of federal dynamic of the bureaucracy comes out through the questions and the responses we got. In some ways, somewhat contradictory for somebody, for me actually, as an observer and a student of federalism, where one is the tensions have always been brought out a lot sharper, and it was also an interesting to see that in fact there are internal dynamics of coordination that exist, which for me brings me to the heart of one of the fundamental accountability questions of how the bureaucracy is organized, how the IAS is organized. This the creation of state cadres, the deputation from a state cadre into the center that builds this. And I think particularly over the last few years, I was looking at some of the data from DOPT that actually that cadre deputation story is beginning to look much thicker for some cadres, much thinner for others, large amounts of vacancies. So some reflections on this, the center-state relationship and where the IAS locates itself.
Yeah, that's actually the subject of a whole discussion in itself. There's always been tension between the center and the states. I think part of the reason is that even though the officers who man the government of India are eventually drawn from state cadres, many of those officers are very happy to be in Delhi and in Government of India, and see themselves much more as GOI officers. We all know that there are officers who stay in the States all their life. There are equally officers who would much rather stay in Government of India all their lives. So I think that back and forth movement has that was originally envisaged, that's kind of broken down a little bit. And I think that is to the detriment of the system, because even though officers are forced to come back for cooling off, they come back, kicking and screaming, basically. They come back just to complete that period, many of them. Some of them will try and keep a foothold in Delhi and so on. But more significantly, I think when you're looking at the issues, when you're starting your service, you are certainly in the field, and you grow into the secretariat before you go to Government of India. And you're very conscious of the problems that you're facing there. And those problems are, of course, there are lots of problems. There's problems of getting the right kind of support. So you might be, you're a young SDM and there's nobody around who can even do any basic analysis for you, tell you how your subdivision is faring on various parameters and all of that. You remember we brought in good governance fellows and so on for meeting those kind of needs. But so you've grown through looking at the weaknesses, and you tend to carry that forward, I think, sometimes into Delhi and say, hey, there are serious problems, incapacities on ground, both in the field, particularly in the field, even perhaps at the state headquarters. So let's meet that issue by being more prescriptive, and then that becomes the big brother, I know best kind of a scenario, and let's tell the states what needs to be done. So my sense is that it's a carry forward of that mindset. But, by way of an example, many of us in the government tend to think there's huge corruption in the government. But when you talk to, for example, when I talk to IAM batchmates and so on, they will say the private sector is equally bad, if not worse, because there is a huge amount of corruption in procurement and in all kinds of things in private companies as well. I'm not talking about private sector being corrupt vis-a-vis public projects. I'm talking about internally within the private sector. But we've seen more of it in the government. And so we are much more, I think, I mean, my sense is maybe some study will reveal this going forward. Anecdotal evidence to me suggests that most IAS officers will probably attribute much more corruption to the government than they would to within the private sector. So I think these tensions of how much responsibility can be cast on the lower levels, how much discretion you want to leave there, it's probably stemming a little bit from those kind of issues. Of course, there is always this fundamental, many people do like to control things, and many of us in the IAS do have that kind of dominant trait. I'm not wanting to completely deny that, but I think there is also this inherent issue around what have been your experiences. I know, for example, as health secretary, I used to talk to the health ministry and say, why don't you organize more conferences for experience sharing, for learning best practice and so on. And that was a very welcome thing that used to happen at least at that time. But the same thing when it translates into directions coming from up top saying, thou shalt do this. And if they're not accompanied by adequate listening to the feedback from the ground, does become a source of some kind of agitation. And I think, therefore, what we saw maybe, I don't know, in the report, this emphasis that there should be delegation, that there shouldn't be these directives, one size fits all, and yet some kind of contradiction between how much mandating you want to do yourself vis-a-vis how much you're willing to accept from someone else. It is there, but I think it's to some extent we know where it's coming from.
Thanks. Sanjeev, you wanted to give a two-finger on this, and then I'll go to Aditi next.
Vini is from Punjab and I'm from Bengal. And I wanted to share that, you see, way back in 1946, when Sardar Patel called a conference of all the premiers and wanted to know whether you want to have the ICAS, whether we should have an All India service, both Punjab and Bengal said we don't want. And I mean, Punjab and Bengal have always been in opposition. So whatever the government of India says, I mean, our states have traditionally, Vini, as you would recall, from the Anandpur Sahib resolution to the CPM rule here, we are quite used to it. But that does not, I mean, that is I just also want to point out that there's a lot of political dialogue that goes on. But that does not mean that that this thing doesn't work or this thing doesn't work. Fasal Bima Yojana works in Punjab, it works in Bengal, it works everywhere. So while there are a lot of tensions between the state and the different states, I do not think that the political dialogue today is at its worst. I mean, we've seen even worse times than this. So my submission is that is precisely the job of the civil service, to ensure that a continuous dialogue goes on. And that is precisely what we've been doing. And let me tell you that the Center for Disaster Management in the Academy, we were compiling the orders which were being issued by all the state governments of various things, and state governments, irrespective of the political dispensation, they've borrowed from each other. I mean, they've been the Rajasthan's circulars have been borrowed by BJP ruled states. I mean, the one circular in West Bengal which said that, come what may, there is 60 rupees the 60 rupees is the entitlement for a migrant worker, and the BDO shall feed it. And the BDO shall be responsible if the migrant worker is not. This was taken over by a lot of states. So there's a lot of, and this is precisely what we do. This was done by the Center for Disaster Management. So I think there is scope to certainly improve, but there is no need to feel so pessimistic or so depressed.
In fact, I think one of the most interesting issues that came up in the early days of the lockdown, when the procurement was beginning in Punjab, was about the closure of all the jute tex mills in West Bengal, and so there were no gunny sacks, and it, for such a reminder of how actually intersected we are. And eventually, I think it was the bureaucratic interaction underneath the political interaction that led all the mills to be opened and the gunny sacks to reach. But I think one of the points, Aditi, that Sanjeev made about the circulars really highlights one of the tensions that I think the report also brought out for us. What the pandemic did for many elites certainly is that for the first time it brought the language of the government into our everyday lives, because now we had to wait for lockdown 1.0, unlock 1.0, unlock 2.0, unlock 3.0 to be told kitne log gaadi mein baithenge, aage kaun baithega, piche kaun baithega, mask kaun pehenega, mask kaun nahi pehenega, falana, all through the language of legalese and deep administrative jargon, which inside the bureaucracy has always been part and parcel of how the bureaucracy gets things done. And in an interesting way, the tension of the lockdown in particular was around trying for the state had to work with citizens, both giving them succor, as well as trying to convince them that the measures that the state was taking was all, in some larger public good, and therefore so it was about deliberation at one level, but it was also about coercion. And you see this in that tension that officers I think it was down the middle, Mehta, if I'm not wrong, where 50% said that everyone complied because of coercion, and the other said it was because it was a joint effort. So how does a rule-bound, aspirationally Weberian structure that operates on these circulars, din bhar circular aata hai in all my work in law bureaucracy, this is the big bane of existence. Pehle circular tha, circular WhatsApp pe bhi aa gaya. How does this circular driven rule bound structure then also start becoming participatory, responsive, deliberative, with the role of coercion always playing at center? So some of your reflections on these tensions in bureaucracy would be helpful at this stage.
Yes, so it's a very interesting question. And I think the first incident that really comes to mind is during this very lockdown. Rajasthan is ruled by the Congress right now as we speak. And there was a lot of press that this whole migrant situation was getting. So we were really completely sort of, I mean, there was just, the newspapers were full of it, the media was full of it. And here in Rajasthan, there was an individual collector of quota who just took it upon himself to ensure that all the, Kota is a big center for tuitions. All the children of the world wanting pre-medical, pre-engineering and so on. There are lakhs and lakhs of children who come from all over, elite children and also some rural and so on. So he basically started just ferrying some of these by bus, some of these children back home. Now this became a cause célèbre. This became completely, discussed in the media. And this became a bit of a source of rivalry, that here the center is doing this to the migrants, look at Rajasthan, look at what we are doing. So I think just to carry this sort of simile forward, that this was a tension, and this was also used to political advantage, as Sanjeev was saying, by the leadership of the Congress here, and to showcase what is happening in the state under their rule. So I think this kind of rivalry, this kind of tension is very much a part of the reality. And as you say, at one level this works, at the other level you do have an interaction among bureaucrats of the different states and government of India. And so, as you say, at the level of circulars, at the level of the orders, there was a time when the number of orders actually passed counting by most of us. We weren't really aware the state government orders and conflicting orders. So I think there was a time of learning and confusion even for the bureaucracy, because nobody really knew what was going on, what was the correct thing to do. And so I think there was this sort of situation. It was an unusual time, certainly.
Thanks, Vini. I think you had a two-finger on the tensions. Then I'll go to the next question.
I wanted to intervene on that, because I think that perhaps the reason why there is such a divide is because of seeing how it panned out on ground. I would say that many of us probably feel that the people were responding in these two different ways. There were people who were convinced about the seriousness of the issue, and they were responding voluntarily because of the communication, and there was pretty good communication happening around it. But there was also a bunch of people who were either not willing or had not been convinced in the same manner, and they were responding to the issue because of the threat of enforced compliance, the police kind of danda threat. So if I had been asked this question, I would have been conflicted on what I believe was the greater factor leading to the compliance. Was it more of one or the other? Because I believe that we saw both things panning out, and therefore some people would have put it in one bucket and some in the other, but my sense is that everywhere people probably felt, I think, that both factors.
A combination of both, absolutely. Sanjeev, there's an interesting question that I am too tempted not to pose to you, which is about both you, Vini, and I'm sure Aditi and Anil will agree as well. The thinness of permanent staff in the bureaucracy, the fact that there's a lot that needs to be done, and there's very few hands to the till relative to what needs to be done. But there's also increasingly a shift in how the bureaucracy is dealing with this challenge, particularly now very visibly actually in the form of private consultants emerging, younger people coming in through these governance fellowships and other such. What are your reflections on the context in which these changes have come? And what do you think this does to the ethos and the culture of the permanent bureaucracy? Last but not the least, what does this tell us about how bureaucracy thinks about the challenge of state capacity itself? Because a critical eye on this would say it clearly seems to be that the answer is not in the system, is to try and bring outsiders in for brief periods of time to plug a few holes and then, without really dealing with the core problem. So just some reflections on that.
No, I think it's a very important point. And what we are doing is we're actually doing an empirical study, and this study will, to actually find out. And in fact, this is something which state governments and ministries ought to be doing. But obviously there is, we are all working under so much pressure, under so many emergency things that we don't get to do it. So in the academy, something that we're doing with Devesh Kapoor is to find out, how many patwaris are actually in position, how many BDOs are actually in position, how many ADOs are actually in position. And once we have this empirical data, we'll be able to tell the state governments to recruit more. One of the things that's happening is that a lot of governments feel that, if you recruit more staff, it doesn't help. The fact is that we are understaffed, but there is no empirical document for us to tell the government of Maharashtra that, look, this is the position. I mean, these are the, because what is happening is that there is, we have DMs everywhere, we have ADMs every day, but when it comes to project officers of DRDA, there's a major shortage. I have an APC of, agriculture production in Bengal, and I realized that out of the 300 odd blocks, we had only 200 ADOs, right? So these are the difficulties which are there, same with primary health centers, same. So once we have this empirical data, it will be easier for us to talk about, how to bring about how to get because state capacity is also dependent on how many people you have, how many working hands you have on the tech. Now, the second question which always comes up is that how do we look at lateral entry? How do we look at governance fellows? How do we look at, I think it's a welcome thing. There's no problem in that. Because we must realize what is our core job. Our core job is to manage districts, to manage directorates, some directorates, and to manage ministries. A lot of the other things that we are doing is an additionality because perhaps, things are, perhaps we don't have. So a good system is one where the IAS officer takes professional advice, and I really find, we always highlight, and this is typical of news, everything. Whenever things are not going right, they highlight it. I mean, let me just give you an example that as the mission director for national horticulture, I got along famously with my horticulture commissioner. We got along famously with the DDG for horticulture, and we could do a lot of things. And yet this will not be highlighted. The fact that the horticulture commissioner and the joint secretary have fought once in 8 years, this will become big news. But the fact that for 30 years we worked together, that is not news. This is also a problem of a system. We've done so well on so many parameters, we don't seem to acknowledge it, we don't seem to highlight it. Where things go wrong, we highlight. Now, you see, one lateral entrant may have had a problem with us, but other 7, 8 lateral entrants are getting along very well with the joint secretaries. They're talking to us, we talk to them. It's fine. If you have a cohort of 10 people, whether it is joint secretaries from the IAS or joint secretaries from the lateral entrants, 2 or 3 will always have problems. I mean, and won't academics have problems with each other? I mean, the sort of problems which academics have with each other, I mean, that makes us feel so happy because you can never agree on anything. So we at least agree on many things. So I think the issue is a complex challenge. I think that while some officers are concerned about lateral entry, I honestly feel that all those IAS officers, and I think 60-70% of us are really hardworking. We do not. We actually look forward to interactions, dialogues, and if the core work is governance, it's not just the IAS. I mean, the IAS is not an end in itself. Let me again, even as the head of the Civil Services Training Institute and also as the vice president of the association, let me say that it's not an end in itself. It is an end to a larger goal, and most individual members of the IAS are also competent to do many other things. Many of us have chosen to be here for a long time because we feel there is something that we can deliver.
Absolutely. Actually, that brings me to the next 2 questions that I wanted to sort of pose to you, Anil, building on what is coming in from the audience as well. One is, what are the qualities of an officer that are necessary to drive them to drive performance in the context of a crisis, especially a multidimensional crisis like this, where there was a requirement for following orders, convincing citizenry, and addressing the public health challenge as well. And relatedly, I think one of the interesting tensions in the responses that we got in the survey, the fact that half of the respondents felt that there was more planning required. The other half felt that the lockdown was right and it just needed to be done, and we had to just deal with whatever it threw up in that context. Both of these sort of tell you something important, and these tensions also tell you something important and interesting about this question of qualities and strength that is needed to respond to multidimensional administration. Actually, this crisis was really typical in some ways. It heightened it, but was typical of the complexity of administration. So some of the reflections on that.
First, a bit of a clarification. I think Sanjeev grossly misunderstood me. I never said that there should be uniformity in the IAS. When I talk of ethos, there has to be some shared values. That is what I meant, and I think I should have those shared values. Obviously, they can't be uniform. Everyone has to be different. Now, coming to the question that you asked, I think fundamentally what is required of an IAS officer, which I feel is the attributes of a leader. And that is where we have the fundamental problem. Right from the point of selection of IAS officer, in the selection process, UPSC is the finest body that we have. No one can doubt it. But who are we selecting? We are selecting people who are good at writing in those 2 hours, good communicators in writing, and someone in speech. Some of them evolve as leaders. But at the point of selection, they are bright and brilliant individuals that come in. So in a pandemic, obviously, there can't be a planning for pandemic, or especially like COVID, which came from nowhere. So you can't plan for a pandemic. But I think guys who had those leadership instincts in them, leadership qualities in them, performed much better than others, because they had this whole attribute of trusting others, of taking people along with them. And that is when a crisis comes, what is the vision, how they can plan, how they can execute, how can they support the people. All these are attributes which are neither tested there. And I'm so glad when Sanjeev mentioned that the academy is now putting a lot of emphasis on developing that attitude. To me, that's extremely important. And it doesn't end there, because if the guys are not mentored appropriately, subsequent to what they're training in the academy, I think they lose it out. As I said, I'm in touch with hundreds of IAS officers, and there is no institutional mechanism of mentoring those guys. One bad day and they start losing faith in the system, which I don't think is good. So what is really required is to develop that. And in all what I've said, the politician doesn't come at all. And here I'd like to bring the point with Vini made. I think it got lost in discussion. I think that's a brilliant point that needs to be emphasized as well as studied. She said that center was playing the role of a facilitator, enabling states to learn from each other, irrespective of the political color of the state. And I can tell you from my personal experience, when I was coal secretary, most of the states where coal existed was run by the opposition governments. West Bengal, Odisha, always, and today almost all. Now, how do? You can't have political battle. That's where a civil servant has to play an important role to negotiate and discuss with his colleagues. That's the advantage of IAS, because your colleague is sitting there, you can do that. Look at what happens to Farms Bill. If you juxtapose the two, the Farms Bill lost out because perhaps the interface with the stakeholders that should have happened did not happen. I mean, that's my understanding of the Farms Bill. A similar coal block auction bill got through like a shot in the parliament because, again, under the inspired leadership of Arun Jaitley, you could sit down and discuss with chief ministers, chief secretaries, convey a value proposition to them. So what Vini was saying, that can we learn from each other? Can civil servants sitting in Delhi become principal facilitators? I tried to do a bit of it as Secretary of Education, picking up good practices from all over the country, road showing it through workshops to other states, and states picked up, irrespective of the political color, picked up those practices. So to me, whether it's pandemic or not pandemic, the role of a civil servant in the field, of course, is has to be a leader. He has a team, he has an army of people who has to execute it. But at the center, the role changes in terms of not becoming Secretary Government of India, but actually engaging with the states, helping states, becoming a principal facilitator. People ask me, how did coal production increase to record levels in 2015-16? Believe me, I didn't convene a single meeting of the state governments in Delhi in 2 years that I was there. Every meeting was in the states. So, and there's no politics in it, because though you are calling on the chief minister, but you are engaging with the chief secretary. I had great experience in chief secretaries in West Bengal and Odisha. They were all colleagues and they would listen to you. They would understand the political limitations on either side and that you couldn't do it. So my suggestion to you is, this is very fine what you've done. How about studying this aspect of bureaucracies engaging with each other, you know, civil servants engaging with each other. The problem that I saw in Delhi, and I worked for a long time in Delhi, that but for the initiative of Prime Minister Modi, we wouldn't have sat down to discuss informally. We only meet in meetings. He constituted the secretaries group, and what a fabulous initiative that was. We understood each other much better in informal settings. No, those type of institutions have to evolve for civil servants to engage with each other, both in informal and formal.
Thank you. I think we're literally at the in the last few minutes left of our conversation. Rohit is here. If you who was in Rajasthan ACS Health in the midst of the pandemic, Rohit, would you like to come in?
Oh, sure. Thank you.
A couple of minutes, and then I'll hand over to Mehta.
So about the coordination between center and state, I think in my 31 years in the IAS, this is the best example of how center responded to our needs, despite us being from a different political dispensation, the government. And government of India was available 24/7 in terms of advice, resources, and everything else. So, and different states were also, comparing notes, and we were constantly, talking to each other, because this pandemic was new, and nobody knew, as Anil Swarup sir said, nobody knew where it came from, and it took us all by surprise. So I think the coordination in form of a competitive spirit between the states and the help that center gave helped us a lot to take us through the pandemic. I mean, I had 4 batchmates who were health secretaries, and we were talking constantly to each other and asking them as to what they were doing as innovation in terms of managing the pandemic, and it did help. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for such an important and engaging discussion. And I think that one of the very important issues, Anil, that you brought out, especially for us, the role of research, the role of reflection, the role of conversion of research into policy, useful, policy relevant ideas, and the conversion of those then further into implementation and change. I think the different roles that all of us as a community also play in this. It's one of the issues that we often reflect on as researchers, as policy researchers as well. Where does the research begin and end? What should academics do versus how we should think about our research? As is it about asking the right question, or is it about asking a question, or is about trying to find an answer to a question that can be implemented? And there are in and of themselves also inherent tensions. So there's a very important conversation, I think, that as a community, if all of us could also engage with around the sort of role of research, its relevance, and the relationship between research, practice, and outcomes, which I think would certainly for us make us better academics and better researchers, but also hopefully produce a community of knowledge that can further the outcomes that we all collectively seek. So we'll trouble you on that one too, now that you've raised this very important question. Mehta and Deepak, can I hand over to you just for your final words of thanks?
It's just to say thank you so much to everyone, to all of the panelists. I think both for the provocations and the challenge, because I think that's really important for any new initiative. We certainly hope this is only the first of many diverse and different studies that we will be undertaking over the next several years. And so we very much hope we can meet back here, not just as Yamini said in 5 years, but even more regularly. But hopefully the possibility of creating spaces for deeper engagement and understanding as the basis on which we then build on. and deepen our engagement in terms of, the possibilities of transforming public administration and state capacity. So for us, I think that is really, the work that we would like to do, and to think about this really as an ecosystem of engagement in which I think research and analytical frameworks play an important role. But I think creating space for networks, for groups of people to reflect, for working in different institutions and capacities is also incredibly important. I also very much want to thank the audience and the questions that have been raised. Many of them we haven't been able to address. Really excellent questions about the role of training institutions, questions about data. Why does a state not have data, not only on the people, as we saw in the case of the pandemic, but also on its, as you said, as Sanjeev Chopra mentioned, on itself, right? Understanding its own workforce and its own people, and that we need to actually do these exercises of figuring out how many patwaris do we have and how many extension officers are in service. So I think really powerful questions that we hope to really take on. Like I said, the State Capacity Initiative is really committed to looking at people, to looking at complex transversal processes and public institutions. And we hope to do this, with all of you in collaboration over the next many years. So this is just a start, and really thank you very much for your very thoughtful and honest reflections and engagement. So on behalf of Aditya, Rahul, Deepak and myself, really thank you very much. Deepak, any last quick words?
No, thanks, Mehta. I think you covered it. Thank you very much, all of you, for responding to our requests and being here today. And there have been very, very critical inputs, which I think will guide us in coming times. Thank you very much, all of you, once again. And Sanjeev, thanks.
Thank you.
There's a lot of
Thank you.
stuff going there. Thank you. Thank you, Vini.
Thank you
Thanks,
for a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.